My name is Brianna Walden, and I'm with the Charles Koch Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the latest in our installment of our book event series, The Butcher, the Brewer, and the Baker. Through these events, we seek to highlight the work of individual authors and engage a broad audience in dialogue about the importance of free societies and how they increase well-being for the overwhelming majority of people. I would especially like to thank the National Review Institute for co-sponsoring this event with us tonight. As the nearly 2,500 alumni of our educational programs could tell you, the Charles Koch Institute welcomes scholarship, debate, and analysis of crucial public policy issues like the ones you'll be hearing about tonight. As part of the Charles Koch Institute's work to foster productive dialogue about various topics among diverse groups, we're pleased to welcome Charles Koch to discuss his new book, The Conservatarian Manifesto, Libertarians, Conservatives, and the Fight for the Right's Future. Charles Koch is a writer at the National Review and a graduate of the University of Oxford, where he studied modern history and politics. His work is focused especially on Anglo-American history, British liberty, free speech, the Second Amendment, and American exceptionalism. Charles is the co-host of the Mad Dogs and Englishmen podcast and has broadcasts for HBO, Real Time with Bill Maher, BBC, MSNBC, Fox News, The Blaze, CNBC, CTV, ABC, Sun News, and CBS. Quite the alphabet soup. His writing has also been published by The National Interest, The Washington Times, The New York Post, in addition to National Review. In his new book, Charles argues that the future of the right is neither libertarianism nor conservatism, but a little bit of both. Koch offers a roadmap for a return to the founding principles and values that set our country on a path to freedom. Charles Koch will be joined by Ewan Watt, External Relations Manager at the Charles Koch Institute. Please join me in welcoming them both.
Thank you for joining us, everyone, this evening, and thank you for Charlie, Charles. And thanks again to the National Review Institute for co-sponsoring this evening's event. I hope we're going to have a back and forth discussion about it, and then we'll leave some time at the end for you guys to ask some questions. So I'm really interested to kind of hear. I mean, it's a bestseller, right? Or at least with the word conservatarian.
Right, it's the best-selling conservatarian book in the market, I think.
So I'm really interested, though. You know, it's not in the book. You kind of talk about what a conservatarian kind of is, and you say it's somebody who might be described as a federalist or a fusionist, as William Buckley often was. What's been the general reaction to it? Have you upset both sides, or have you kind of, won over one side, or has it gone?
Well, I think I've upset everyone, and that's good. My wife wanted to be involved with some of the writing. It's quite a lonely process writing a book, and so she took dictation. She's much more conservative than I am, and I knew I was going somewhere good when she started looking up and sighing as I was speaking. So certainly it's annoyed some conservatives, and if you read the Amazon reviews, it's annoyed some libertarians as well. But it should do, because I am critical of pretty much everyone on the right. And that's partly because the book contains a lot of myself and my own criticisms, and it's partly because it is a genuine attempt to look into an emergent movement. I did not invent the word conservatarian. It's an ugly word, but it is a word that is in increasing use. If you talk to people on the right, they will say, when I'm around conservatives, I feel libertarian. When I'm around libertarians, I feel conservative. Some of them use the word liberservative, which is even uglier. And then they will explain to you why they are of that position. Now, some of them, let's be honest, just don't want to call themselves Republicans. Some of them don't want to call themselves conservative. Some of them perhaps are more conservative, but were disappointed by the Bush administration. But there is also a genuine substantive criticism, especially among younger people, much of this is generational, that is forming this new bloc. And I wanted to have a look at it. I wanted to work out where it had come from and then offer some suggestions as to where it could go.
So it does seem, though, that much of the book is prompted by some of your issues with conservatism, particularly compassionate conservatism under the Bush years. I think there's a part of the book where you say, movements are often at risk of stagnation and calcification, and then you cite the conservative position on drugs, gay marriage, defense, and on the structure of government. Rather than this kind of being a conservatarian manifesto, do you not think much of this is really just a critique of conservatism over the past 10 years or so?
Some of it is, but equally, and I just did an interview at Reason, libertarians do not like the chapters on immigration and on defense. They don't like, or some libertarians don't like the position on abortion. So I do think this does go down the middle in many ways. I don't think it is just a criticism of conservatives now.
So it wasn't one side that kind of prompted this piece of work?
Well, no, because this is my impression. And if anyone here thinks they're a conservatarian and disagrees with my articulation of what that means, that's fine. This is my attempt. But the gist that I got was that there is a movement that is sort of fiscally conservative, disagrees with conservatives on gay marriage, on federalism, or at least their lack of fealty to the federalist principle, and on drugs, but is not on board with libertarians, at least in a doctrinal libertarian sense, on immigration, on foreign policy, and again, on the question of abortion. Some of those people as well may be more culturally conservative, even if they're more libertarian in their politics.
So this kind of leads me on to my next question, because your critique of libertarians, you said that you get the sense that sometimes they're far too ideological, I guess is what you said. Isn't that kind of the reaction, though, maybe in a time where principles are perhaps up for sale, that libertarians kind of, because I know one of the critiques is that they don't want to become electable or something like that. I mean, isn't that something that you'd like to, isn't that something, though, aren't principles important? Sure.
It's not a criticism of principle, it's a criticism of those particular principles. If you take immigration, for example, my view is that libertarians often put the cart before the horse. They will say, well, I accept that the welfare state makes open borders difficult, but I don't believe in the welfare state. Well, that's fine. I'm critical of the welfare state too, but it exists. It is there. There is no sign that it's going away. That's an important point to make when discussing immigration with libertarians, that unless your view, and I don't share this, unless your view is that by opening up the borders and removing any government authority whatsoever there, that it will crash the welfare state, that it will heighten the contradictions, and that's an argument. But until that view is made, it's just wishful thinking, and there is a little bit of that within libertarianism, I think, that needs knocking.
The point about Milton Friedman, why he supported legal immigration in the first place, right?
Sure, I mean, Milton Friedman was probably more of an immigration squish than I am, and he still made this exact point.
Right. So we're going to go over some issue areas that you cover in the book. We might not have enough chance to go over them, which I'll let you guys. I think we've already mentioned what Charlie's been talking about, so we can you guys can ask some questions there. You talk about how conservatarians are largely defined by what they're for rather than what they're against. And I know one part of the book you kind of talk at the start about the damage that's been done to the conservative brand, I said 10 years over the last, perhaps what's been going on in the past 20 years or so. Isn't a lot of this, down to the sense of, does it not come down to trust to an extent? Sure. And, you quote Coolidge when he talks about how the business of America is business. Isn't that a large part of it? And that people are trusting business over markets?
I suppose what you're asking me is, do I think the Republicans, when in power, have privileged specific businesses rather than a libertarian environment?
Yeah.
No, that's absolutely true. But it's not just that. Look, George W. Bush can be given a little leeway in that he did not expect 9/11. That did change his presidency. There's no question about it. But if you look at how he ran in 2000, all of the telltale signs were there. I mean, he ran as a so-called compassionate conservative. It was a break with the Reagan era. It was a break with the contract with America. It was an attempt to soften the blow after Clinton. There was nothing about the Twin Towers being knocked down that necessitated no child left behind. There was nothing about the invasion of Afghanistan that necessitated the expansion of Medicare. There was nothing outside of increased spending on foreign affairs that forced him to sign a vast expansion of government after a vast expansion of government. Now, I think that a good number of conservatives, and the nice thing about being on the right at the moment is these people have more of a voice than they did in 2000. They're much more active. I'm sure many of them are in this room. The nice thing is that I don't think he'd get away with it now. But of course there was disappointment. It wasn't just Iraq, it wasn't just Afghanistan, it wasn't just 9/11 and the security state. This was how he actually ran for office. And Republicans had full control of the government when these measures went through.
But what about, I know a lot of people kind of talk about this comparison, maybe I should have phrased it differently. You can maybe look at the past 20 years as a sign of crony capitalism. And it's still, when we have this debate right now in DC around Exim Bank, for example, there's still some people reluctant to take that position. I think there was a wonderful George Will article this week in the Washington Post about it, about Exim Bank. What is it then about people on the right who are still more who I guess are still more trusting of a large government or corporatist role in the economy than just trusting markets?
Well, power corrupts. It's very, very difficult to get people who've been elected to stand on that sort of principle. They have campaign contributions, and I'm fine with that.
Libertarian critique.
Yes, and it's the correct critique, and it's one that I make in the book. Think where we'd be without the libertarian movement within the party. Think where we'd be without the Tea Party, which can be problematic, but nonetheless stands. Think where we'd be without Tim Carney, for goodness sake. The fact that these voices just over and over and over again keep pointing, and we're still seeing a support for business and not for markets. And I had a conversation last week that depressed me with a friend in Austin, Texas, who said, Republicans down there with Uber they take just as much convincing as they do in Washington. You'd think Texas would be a place in which Uber would thrive, but nope, they're just as intractable.
So a lot of your book, you focus on how the right needs to be far more tolerant of people, and how people live their lives, which is a very Lockean concept. Is this where the right might be kind of traditionally be losing people, and that they're not largely seen as a very compassionate movement? Is that accurate?
I think it depends on the issue. I'm very keen in the book to differentiate between different so-called social issues. If we're going to be honest about it, both intellectually and electorally, the three main social issues have nothing to do with one another. The question of drugs is the question of what role the government should play in the market for substances. Should you be allowed to grow them? Should you be allowed to produce them? Should you be allowed to trade them and possess them and ingest them? Should you be allowed to move them across state lines? That's question one. The second question, gay marriage, is which of civil society's institutions does the state recognize and in what form? And the third question, abortion, is at what point is a life a life? What should we do to protect that life, if anything, and what amount of force should we apply and at what point? Now, they are lumped together regularly, but they're not the same question. And indeed, if you look at attitudes toward them, not just intellectually, but in terms of voters, they differ. Younger members of the Republican Party, younger people within the right, are increasingly in favor of gay marriage, and they're increasingly in favor of drug legalization. But on abortion, they're not. That firstly should tell you that they're not all linked. So in terms of the future, Republicans really have two challenges. Conservatives or libertarians or the right or what you will have two challenges. The first is trying to reconcile their philosophy and their platform with differing attitudes on those three social issues. And the second is generational, because the right is going to, probably not in 2016, but it's eventually going to run up against a problem in that it has a vast number of older Americans who vote for it in some regards because of its position on gay marriage and maybe drugs, and then a good number of younger Americans who think that their positions on those two questions are intolerant. I'm not too worried about the abortion question because it is actually trending in the direction of the right. So whatever one thinks of abortion, I don't think it's going to cause too many problems. Also, legally, it's been settled. But the questions of gay marriage and abortion and drugs, are certainly going to be a problem, yeah.
So for those three key issues, do you think additional federal, you address federalism a lot for that, but do you think the solution is for federalism or decentralization?
Sure, I do, yes. Now, whether that's going to happen legally and politically is another question. This is a long project. I don't expect this to happen overnight. You're already seeing a demand for it with the question of marijuana. I mean, the people in Colorado and the people in Washington got together and decided they wanted to legalize the drug. But at the federal level, you have a set of laws that make that decision, well, depending on how the Attorney General is feeling, either illegal or at least unwise. The word of the day there is caprice. So you are seeing more pressure than you would normally. And if they're joined by other states in the next few years, that is eventually going to have to come to a head. Now, my attitude toward that, and I think the correct constitutional attitude toward that, is to say that the federal government should get out and that the states should be able to take their own decisions. Personally, I would legalize every single drug, but I would do so slowly, and I would accept that this is not for the federal government to impose. The good news on that is actually you do have some conservatives who have some respect for that. If you look at Paul Ryan, who's a conservative man, his view is that he would vote for criminalization of marijuana if he were a Wisconsin politician, and he's personally against it. But he's suggested he'd be open to the federal government getting itself out. And that might be a way of bridging that gap. Not just that would be good for America, but that would also be good for anyone running under the conservative, Republican, libertarian banner, whatever you want to call it.
We're going to get onto the issue of drugs very soon. But in the book, you also talk a great deal about constitutional limitations. And there's this fantastic debate going on between libertarians and conservatives. The one side that thinks really being led by the Institute for Justice, that talk a great deal about judicial engagement. And the other side, I think, that's probably associated more with the work wing of the conservative movement, that's more judicial restraint. And while you talk there's a part in the book where I think you're quite dismissive of the so many rights that have been discovered in the 14th Amendment. So a conservatarian, kind of which side would they fall on there?
So I think this is really complicated. And I imagine everyone in the room has a different answer to this. I'm going to start by saying something really obvious, and then I'm going to try and answer your question. Unless you think that Marbury v. Madison was decided wrong and that the Supreme Court should not be overseeing laws, you are a judicial activist of some sort. All of us are. Now, I can forgive people who come to a different constitutional conclusion than I do and therefore wish the court to step in. That is, unless you think Marbury was wrong, that is why it's there. I can't forgive those who essentially say, by all means necessary, I want this, therefore the Constitution must say it. And I can't forgive our current media environment in which every single Supreme Court decision is treated as if the court were a legislature. What will happen if? You never see legal discussions on television. You only see discussions of policy. If the Constitution means anything, it has to have a fixed, as far as is possible, it has to have a fixed meaning, and otherwise you just have caprice and you have no way of upholding individual rights. Now, as regards your question, which side am I on? It really depends on the issue, Ewan. So I think that Lochner was wrong. I see no basis for that. I'm not a lawyer. These are my historical, these are my historical and legal judgments. I also think that Wickard v. Filburn was wrong. I think that was essentially a constitutional amendment. If you look at the way this Commerce Clause was supposed to work in the United States, what they did in 1942 was to blow open the capacity of the federal government to involve itself. And I was just talking yesterday actually with Rick Brookhiser, a great historian of the period, and he was saying that in 1799, Hamilton jotted down a bunch of constitutional amendments that he wanted. One of them was the capacity to build canals over more than one state line. He thought that required an amendment. Madison vetoed a bill in 1817 on the same principle. in 1942, the court amended the Constitution. I think they got that one wrong. I would like to see much more involvement on policing the bounds of federalism. This ship has probably sailed, but given you asked the question. Now, on Ninth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, so-called substantive due process, I don't see those as being necessarily justiciable. I think that the Ninth Amendment, the cases that are brought in the name of so-called substantive due process, they are conflating the presumption of a free society with legally enforceable rules. There are, of course, some exceptions to this, but generally speaking, no. I'm more with Bork, for example, on the 14th Amendment. I'm with Bork on... did you pronounce it Luffner? Have I been pronouncing that wrong for years?
I just disagree with you.
No, I know you do.
No matter how you pronounce it.
No, I know we disagree on this. So, I mean, I think it comes down to, and again, this sounds very obvious, it comes down to how you read each part of the Constitution. It comes down to what you think it says. And I don't think that the 14th Amendment allowed the federal courts to invalidate state statutes governing contracts. To me, this is preposterous, but I'm sure we can argue this over a drink.
So there's not a right to contract in the 14th Amendment?
No.
Over a drink it is. Executive power, and how can that be rolled back? Has that ship sailed?
No, it hasn't sailed. So one of the things I keep being asked on this book, which candidate do you like? Now I understand why that's being asked, but it's really the wrong way of looking at it. And in fact, it perpetuates a tendency within American politics that I think is quite dangerous. How many times do you hear, well, Barack Obama won? He won. Yeah, he did. He did win. That's true. He won twice. He is the president of the United States. He won fair and square. But so did everyone in Congress. And so did everyone at the state level as well. I'm not particularly interested in working out whether Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz or Rand Paul would be the best president, outside of choosing somebody to lead the executive branch. If any of the ideas in here come to fruition, it will be because the people at the bottom are demanding them. No politician is going to go to Washington. Well, in fact, no politician is going to be elected to Washington if they say, do you know what, I believe in this sort of federalist libertarian idea, so I don't have any views on this. That's not going to work in a general election. And it's not going to work when they are in power either. So my basic thesis for change, and again a long-term one, is that eventually people will be sick of using Uber but voting for the taxi commission. And they'll be sick of using Facebook and being asked to vote for the FCC. And when that happens, and we're seeing it to a limited extent with marijuana, when states and local communities recognize that they're being preempted by people that really shouldn't have a say over how they live, then you will start to see a change. Not because somebody makes a big deal of it in a stump speech.
Well, you touched upon the next issue I was going to talk about. It's quite incredible to think that, for example, Chris Christie and, I think it's even Rick Perry, who have declared the war on drugs a failure. Mm-hmm. Is this a sign of conservatives moving towards good policy because they've seen that failure, or is it just too difficult to fight?
Unfortunately,
because you use the same kind of argument with guns when you basically say that actually with 300 firearms in the country, we basically can't regulate firearms.
300 million. It's 300 in my house.
Yeah.
I don't own them all. I'd be invincible.
Concealing half.
Yeah, absolutely. Non-DC, absolutely not. No. I don't think enough conservatives feel like Rick Perry. And indeed, the younger Republican support for revisiting the war on drugs statistically does seem to be limited to marijuana. I have been invited to fewer dinner parties since I said heroin should be legalized. To me, there is an intellectual inconsistency here. Conservatives profess to believe two key things. One is that the countries and its government should be bound and informed by the constitutional order. Now, I would defy you to find, even with all the amendments, an originalist argument for federal involvement in the drug war. There are a host of federal departments. $51 billion a year is spent. We see the violation of explicitly enumerated rights. The Fourth Amendment is the key. Radley Balker wrote a great book about this. And generally, conservatives sit there and they say nothing. The second value, or virtue rather, that conservatives believe they possess is the ability to take down government programs that don't work. Now, it's been about 150 years since marijuana was first criminalized. Not everywhere, but this was when it started. The drug war in its current form has been, let's say, 45 years in the making. Now, there have been, I'm sure, some benefits. It would be ridiculous to say there haven't. Drugs are dangerous. Libertarians occasionally make it sound as if they're not, but drugs are dangerous and bad for you. I will accept that. But the consequences, even aside from the constitutional question, are increasingly deleterious. Jimmy Carter thought we should legalize marijuana in the 1970s because the prison population was, a third of what it is now. This was an imperative for him. We have so many young people in prison whose lives have been ruined by childish indiscretions. And we have politicians who don't seem to recognize that there, but for the grace of God, Ted Cruz admitted that he tried it in his youth. Jeb Bush admitted that he tried it in his youth, and yet Jeb Bush still believes in mandatory minimum sentences. He opposed a law in Florida that would have spared his own daughter jail time, and he opposed medical marijuana as well. I would like to know where the conservative reforming zeal is that we've seen on firearms, that we've seen on the war on poverty, that we've seen, although it wasn't conservatives so much, that we saw during the Prohibition era. It's not there. And I think conservatives, they don't just damage their brand when they do that, but they damage the country.
So I'm glad you bring up mandatory minimums, because that's an incredibly topical issue right now in Washington. Why has it been so difficult for, I don't want people thinking I'm picking on conservatives, this just seems to be some of the issues that you're picking out here. Why has that been such a difficult issue for people to change on?
Well, there was
it's a generational thing, right?
Well, it's partly a generational thing, and it's partly because the country has changed and not everyone realizes it. In 1993, crime hit its spike. Now, I write a lot about this because I write about firearms. Most people don't realize in America, Pew says about 12% of Americans realize that crime is down. Gun crime is down as well. You have, just to stick with guns for a second, you have about a halved gun murder rate since 1993. You have gun crime down at 75%. The crime, depending on which statistical set you look at, is today where it was in either 1980 or 1960 when John F. Kennedy was inaugurated. Now, in 1993, crime was a serious problem. Conservatives, Republicans could win Illinois largely on the crime question. And so I believe, is it Chuck Grassley who's particularly bad in this area? He is still in that mindset. And his view will be, and those like him, their view is that the reason that crime is down is because of these measures. Well, I don't think the evidence is there to support that anymore. But if you do talk to Americans of a certain age, they remember what it was like in 1993, and they don't want to go back to being soft on crime because they think the result will be to go back to 1993 levels of violence. I don't believe that for a moment. I think that there are other factors involved. I think economic growth is the largest of them. I think that culture is another one. But that, to me, is the main reason that you've seen a reluctance to engage.
You mentioned Radley Balker there, and I know too, when people start seeing MRAPs patrolling streets that have gone from Helmand to Ohio, people start getting concerned. And I know with my colleagues, everybody seems to be pointing out that this has actually been something libertarians have been talking about for a very long time.
Right.
And now that it's kind of front and center in the news, there's a little bit of public outrage. I mean, again, why is this something that people are? Is it a security thing? Is it a public safety thing? Why is it that the militarization of the police has been something that's been so difficult to kind of catch on?
I think it's still, I think you say has been, I think it is still. After the media decided after those images from Ferguson that this was the moment for the militarization of the police. I wish it had been, but it wasn't. The polls in the aftermath showed 55-60% support for the tactics used. There was no great outcry against it. To be honest with you, I don't know the answer to that question. I think law and order is well ingrained in the American psyche, and I think I think voters believe perhaps criminals are slightly better armed than they are. I would say, as I've written before, it's something you should be worried about, because there really is no point in having laws that go back to English common law that prevent the military from patrolling within the United States if the military just sends all of its equipment to local police departments and they do it in lieu. And that strikes me as not technically illegal, but absurd. And that's what we've started to see. Maybe in some parts of the border where the cartel wars are in force, you would need some of this equipment, but not in the middle of Ohio.
So you appear critical of both Barack Obama and George W. Bush's foreign policy. Is it fair to say that a conservatarian is more of the realist kind of restraint school of foreign policy?
Sure. So my basic thesis here is that the Barack Obama moment was in some way necessitated by the fallout from Iraq, and that far from being un-American or egregious within the American context, it was a resurfacing of an instinct that has been there since the founding. Americans go through periods of reluctance to play a role on the international stage. The farewell address of George Washington, you see this in Thomas Jefferson, you see this even during the Civil War with Seward explaining to the Russians why America's not going to get involved. And you saw it after the First World War, you saw it after Vietnam, and you saw it again after Iraq. And Barack Obama tapped into that. It wasn't new, it was a fairly typical American response to an entanglement abroad that went badly. The difference is that unlike in immediate post-colonial history and in the aftermath of the First World War, the United States does now find itself in a different position than it did in 1880 or 1910 or even 1930. The British Empire collapsed. It was exhausted and broke at the end of the Second World War. And overnight, the United States was handed that baton and that responsibility, and broadly the same responsibilities, which involved making sure that the world was safe for commerce, that the seas would be free and open, and that the liberal order could survive. And my criticism of libertarians here is not that their instincts are wrong or that they're out of touch with American values, but that for better or for worse, the United States is now in that position and has that responsibility. Now, as you say, Barack Obama likes to pretend that there are only two choices. There is either you bomb everywhere and invade everywhere at once, or you're an isolationist. But that's simply not true. The United States can maintain international primacy, can maintain the capacity to interfere, yes, when it needs to, without having to have gone into Iraq. Indeed, it did so in the 1980s, largely. So I am critical of libertarians here. I don't expect libertarians to agree with me, but I think it's probably important for conservatives to understand where they're coming from, why they are vexed by the Bush administration's forays, and then to explain, sorry?
And the current.
Well, you're absolutely right, sorry, and the current administration, although it must be said we have seen a lot less war protests while Obama's been president. I think that difference, I think that change in America's role is important to acknowledge, because somebody will fill the void.
And that's your concern.
Right, absolutely. No question. And I think it's supported by recent history. I mean, I think we are very lucky and almost complacent because from 1815, after the Battle of Waterloo, to the present day, we have lived in a world, even though they've made mistakes, in which two broadly liberal and benevolent powers have been in control. The world would look an awful lot different if the Ottoman Empire had been the preeminent world power until 1945. It would look an awful lot different, obviously, if the Germans had won. The regime that we have internationally of trade, of commerce, of communication, what was the Pax Britannica is now the Pax Americana, is not normal. If you were to put the Chinese or the Russians or the French, a nightmare for me as a British person, in charge, you would see a different world. Now, I respect the arguments that would be willing to take that risk. I'm not.
So it's that wonderful John Quincy Adams quote that you highlight in the book as well, that America should be going around in search for monsters to destroy.
That's right. And I think if you look at where America involved itself prior to 1945, except a few of Teddy Roosevelt's successes, the Monroe Doctrine made perfect sense within that notion because it was America's backyard. So I don't think that was an exception to it. But yes, I think America should not be proactive in looking for fights, but I don't want anyone else who is in the driver's seat. No.
So you pick up a lot around defense spending, and you know that there's this strange mindset where people feel uncomfortable with big government that seem to think throwing lots of money in the Department of Defense, you're not going to get any waste, and it's all going to be used in a competent manner. Is that changing? Is that approach changing?
No, but it has to. Conservatives are tolerant of wasteful spending in the Defense Department in a way that they would not be in any other circumstance. I mean, it would be on the front page of conservative media every single day. A couple of years ago, it was revealed that the Defense Department doesn't know anything about its budget and can't. Where else would we tolerate this? It opens the right up. This is not to ignore the hugely wasteful procurement process, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. We need a military. The military has to be run at the federal level. You can't have 50 armies. But when you have a political culture within the Defense Department that is as wasteful as it is and as cavalier as it is, making that argument becomes all the more difficult because your critics will say, well, you're very, very aware of the slightest wastage within the food stamp program. But then when it comes to defense, and I think that's a good argument. I also think that progressive arguments against conservatives on defense spending are keen when they say that, you've heard conservative politicians make the case that we need defense spending because it's good for the economy. That's a terrible argument. It's an argument they would accept nowhere else. If domestic non-defense spending is not justifiable because it would create jobs or some magical multiplier effect that we usually mock, there's no reason for defense spending too. I would like a military base in South Carolina because it gets me elected is not a better argument than I would like a bridge building factory. It's just as silly. And so I think that if you want to make the argument, as I do, that you need a military, it needs to be well funded, and that it needs to be engaged, then you have to take that critique seriously. And look at, to finish my point, look at the attitude towards sequestration. The slightest of spending cuts, and it had to be killed from the right because it involved tiny cuts to the Defense Department.
But was there not also a lot of more hawkish conservatives who wanted to protect the sequester? Because they still ultimately see the debt as a much bigger threat to national security.
Not in well, I wouldn't say that they outnumbered those who wish to get rid of it. No.
Won't name names. Well,
You probably hang out with different people than me, though.
Yeah, maybe. Still, go to the same parties that advocate the legalization of drugs.
True.
Anyway, so I want to kind of go out in a positive note. What is it about conservatarianism that appeals to people who otherwise may not donate to, say, the Reason Foundation or Cato or something like that? What is it, or the Heritage Foundation? What is it about conservatarianism that's different?
Well, I'm, as you can probably hear, from England originally. Faking this accent was the best career move I ever made. When somebody says they're a conservative in England, they don't mean what they mean when they say they're a conservative in America. It depends on what you're conserving, obviously. British conservatives have a free market side, at least after Mrs. Thatcher, but they tend to be in favor of maintaining the monarchy, the House of Lords, the Church of England. This is a sore spot, I'm sure, because Ewan is Scottish and I'm English, so there's this simmering resentment here. It's not simmering, right? In America, they are preserving what is a radical set of ideas after a radical revolution. The next day after the revolution, everyone is a conservative. It's the way that revolutions go. And at its root, the American conservative tradition has created space for civil society and space for business and space for individual liberty in a way that no other political philosophy or movement ever has in human history. And I moved here because of that. The benefits of that should be obvious, especially in a world with quick, radical, exciting technological change and a generation coming up that is used to it. Unfortunately, when one is a conservative, one often seeks to conserve everything, which is not a terrible instinct in the short term, but can become obstinate. And my view is that on the questions of gay marriage and on the question of marijuana legalization and maybe a few other areas, conservatives are holding on for too long to the way things were, and they're therefore overshadowing the necessity and the beauty of a message that really is applicable to everybody. And so what I hope is that without destroying the conscience rights or the local communities of those who dissent, the conservative movement in the future can cast itself as that radical, permissive framework that will allow individuals to thrive. And if I didn't believe that that could ultimately win and that would be appealing to people, then I wouldn't have bothered writing a book. I would have just bought a large crate of whiskey, moved to Wyoming, and lived under a tree. So hopefully the bridge is appealing, because at its root, the philosophy is a radical one.
Well, Charlie, thanks for joining us this evening. And I think I wanted to leave some time, 20 minutes or so, for some questions. I think we've got some mic runners. One, two.
Regarding the point that you made about why conservatives feel like defense spending is something you can't touch, what's the reason behind that? Do you think the old chicken hawk idea that they kind of give the military a blank check because, I guess, guilt from Iraq and Afghanistan? What's the reason that conservatives refuse to treat that like they would other issues?
Well, I think one of the problems is inherent to my position, actually, and it's something that people like me need to watch. When you have accepted that the United States is really the only nation that can remain in the prime position globally, you have to watch for the tendency to write it a blank check, right? Because there's always going to be another threat. There's always going to be another area that requires funding. I think when you add into that a respect for the military that is probably unique among the developed nations of the world. Americans are especially respectful toward their soldiers. You have a combination that can be fiscally lethal. The other problem I would imagine is that it is true that the balance between social spending and defense spending has been inverted over the last 60 years. It was the case that more than half the federal budget, I think during the Eisenhower administration, was spent on defense. Now it's down in the 20s. The big drivers of the deficit outside of defense spending are Social Security and to a larger extent Medicare and other healthcare costs. And there must be a fear in the Pentagon that this is going to lead to unsustainable cuts, that is, again, overpronounced. It's not a very sexy answer. It's akin really to the answer of, well, what is America's role in the world then? If you don't want to go into Iraq, but you also want to be the most powerful. It's a difficult one to navigate, but I think that the fear is real. But I think, again, it's possible to maintain your supremacy as a nation and to make sure that those who really don't support American supremacy don't get their way without losing your mind.
All right, Charles. So I was flipping around on my smartphone here, and I was surprised to see what I thought was just one case was more than one. There, in several states, are circumstances where religious bakers are being compelled by state authorities to bake gay marriage cakes. Now, obviously, a lot of traditional conservatives are very concerned that if gay marriage is put into state acceptance and recognized on a federal level, that there would be a slippery slope, that in their churches they're of course forced to, or mosques or synagogues or what have you, forced to perform these ceremonies. And we've even seen that in, I believe, Northern Europe in some places. But as for other trappings of the ceremony, which are nebulously religious or nebulously secular, like the cake, what do you make of these cases that seem to have come up repeatedly, and I think we'll probably continue to do so? I think Colorado and Oregon, these were matters. Thank you.
Well, I'm critical of these laws from the ground up. This is where I get myself into hot water with the left, but so be it. There is a significant difference in my mind between civil rights laws that govern the state and must be, and I make this point clearly in the book, that as much as I'm a localist, these are federal questions now and must be. And the behavior of private individuals. The notion of having a DMV that wouldn't hand out driver's licenses to African Americans, or an IRS that charged British writers a higher tax rate, is inherently disgusting, because there is no choice but to interact with them. One cannot get a driver's license anywhere else. One cannot pay one's taxes to a private institution. When it comes to private businesses, I think the question is a much more thorny one. The case in New Mexico with Elaine Photography contained within it a sentence that should chill anybody who cares about liberty, that the price of her citizenship was to serve those she disliked or who violated her conscience. 81% of Americans disagreed with that, for what it's worth. I do as well. Now, I'm aware that this is an extremely touchy topic in America, and for good reason. I wrote a piece last week in which I contended that the march in Selma was every bit as important an American moment as the Battle of Yorktown, and that the greatest tyranny that has ever been visited upon the United States was visited by white supremacists in the South, both during slavery and segregation. The British, in comparison, were rather nice, although I am, of course, in favor of the outcome of the revolution. It was nothing akin to what Ida B. Wells was reporting lynchings, burnings, beatings, and so forth. But there is a difference between a culture in which there is pervasive bigotry to the extent that one cannot go shopping or go to a diner or walk outside, and a free market within which a person really has a wide array of choices and wishes to force somebody else. The religious question should go without saying. The day that churches are forced to make any marriage arrangements with which they disagree is the day I flick the safety off my rifle. The question of private businesses, I think, is more thorny, but I'm with Elaine Photography in her capacity to refuse anybody for any reason. One does not need to use a particular baker or photographer. It's not as if there aren't a good number of bakers who will cater for gay weddings, let's be honest, and I don't know why anyone would want to be served by people who hate them.
You're talking about the debate among the right for immigration, gay marriage, drugs. Some of these issues are popular in the mainstream, but how could conservatarian ideas be accepted by the mainstream so we would indeed shrink the size of government?
Well, as I say, this is a long-term project, and for me, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen from the bottom up. It's going to happen because the right's going to want to win, and it's going to want to be able to coexist. So in the question of gay marriage, eventually a Republican candidate, at the very least, is going to have to say, well, I don't have a view on this at the federal level. As for the country at large, as I suggested earlier, very few people are going to turn around tomorrow and say, you know what, I just read Charles Cook's book and now I agree with everything that he says. His principles and ideology seem perfect to me. That's not how the world works. It didn't happen in 1980. Ronald Reagan did not win because everybody suddenly became a supply-sider. Mrs. Thatcher did not win because everybody suddenly decided that the last 30 years of British public policy had been disastrous and that she was right. They voted for her because there were bodies and trash piling up in the streets. They voted for Reagan in large part because they were worried about the foreign situation and there were gas lines around the corner. The key, I think, for conservatives on the right and with the public at large is to point out the next time that somebody who thinks that they're a progressive complains about the weed situation in Colorado, that it is precisely his form of government that makes that clash more likely. If you read the Raich decision, is everyone familiar with the Gonzalez Raich decision? It was essentially a second Wickard-Filburn in which it was deemed that the federal government had the right to go after those growing marijuana purely for themselves. The amicus briefs in that case are fascinating. It's all sorts of progressive groups who agree with the marijuana question in general, but were terrified that the federal government was going to lose power in other areas. So they sided with the government crushing this marijuana producer. I think conservatives have to do a much better case of saying, you know what, that's what we're about. We don't want the federal government to come in. Now, one of the big problems is that the conservatives do want the federal government to go in. So I accept I have my work cut out in the first instance. But long term, you're going to win by making the principle applicable to everybody. And at the moment, it's actually not so much Common Core aside, Obamacare aside. It's not just the right that is worried about Washington and its influence. And you can tell this because every time we hear that a Republican might be president in 2016, the left freaks out. They freaked out during the Bush administration. Now, why do they do that? They do that because they're really worried that whoever it is will come in and then will pass all sorts of laws that they don't like that will affect them locally where they live. Well, it needs to be pointed out, we can change that. The libertarians in the mix would like to change that so that you don't really have to worry who is the president. As I say, that's going to be a long-term project. I would like to get to a point where we elect a president and then never hear from him again unless there's an earthquake or a war. But I accept that's going to take a while, and it's going to be from the bottom up, not from the top down.
Taking off that question from your earlier discussion, let me throw a brief hypothetical at you. Understanding this is all very theoretical, but if the Supreme Court tomorrow were to, for example, uphold Chicago or Illinois' gun restrictive laws, but did so based on the idea of that the incorporation doctrine was no longer valid, thus that none of the Bill of Rights were applicable to the states because they were a restriction on the federal government power. Would you be in support of that kind of idea, or the restriction on the incorporation doctrine?
I would, because I think the incorporation doctrine is nonsense. Of course, this is a extremely heated, I'm getting an evil eye. It's an extremely heated legal question. I personally think that would be a reasonable decision, yes. Just to answer a question you didn't ask, the Second Amendment is always a good question because people know that I'm a staunch advocate of it. And they ask, well, you keep talking about localism and federalism, but you don't want there to be vibrant federal differences within firearms law. And the answer to that is no, because until such time as the incorporation doctrine would be overturned, it is a constitutional right. As I say, when it comes to civil rights, when it comes to the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, anything that is enumerated, that is, of course, an exception. Now, that's not to say, it's not to say that there is not some latitude. I actually think that conservatives, they go a little far sometimes with the Second Amendment. They just think the shall not be infringed bit should be taken literally. And it shouldn't. There is room for a slightly different regime in New York City than in Utah. They are different places with different needs. It does, of course, have to obey the constitutional text and the constitutional order. But broadly speaking, until such time as that happens, you cannot, of course, have that. Those are exempt from the question at hand. But yes, absolutely.
One more right in the back there.
So recently, Dr. Ben Carson on CNN said that regarding gay marriage, the definition of marriage shouldn't have to be changed. What do you think about that?
Well, it doesn't have to be changed outside of the state. The state is not imposing, by changing its definition, there's no stoats involved. The state is not forcing anybody to change their definition. It's not forcing an individual to change his definition or a church to change his definition. It is altering what it will recognize as a contract between a man and a woman that has hitherto been referred to privately in civil society as marriage. Now, this gets a little bit tricky because one of the reasons I think that the plaintiffs in the various cases that we've seen want gay marriage is because they want to enjoy the imprimatur of marriage. You see this in the way Justice Kennedy writes. Equally, with the way that the state is involved in our lives, they want the various legal benefits, immigration benefits, welfare, social security, hospital visitation, and so forth. That makes it difficult, say, to get the government out. And so people confuse what the state would be doing with what would be done in some sort of cosmic sense. And I don't have a problem when a Catholic says, well, I don't recognize that as a marriage. To me, that's not a marriage. That's fine. The church doesn't have to recognize it as a marriage. And indeed, if there were any government attempt to force them to, as I say, that's the point at which I would lose it. But we are discussing here only the state. If the state wishes to change the definition of that institution as it's recognized, that's fine.
We have time for one more. I think it was right in the back there. We can get the microphone over.
Hey, quick question. I guess some of your colleagues and probably other people well have in this Reformicon camp, I think they're calling themselves, they've advocated for, say, child tax credits and a lot of other things, trying to help out middle-class people, saying we need a more affirmative agenda than just markets work, we need to do something specific. So I'm wondering if conservatarianism, if, as you see it, takes any side on this.
This is going to sound like a cop-out, but one of the things that I really wanted to avoid doing was to write a book in which I said this should be up to local communities, states, and individuals. Here is what I think they should choose. Insofar as the Reformicon agenda is being introduced at the federal level, I suppose I should have an opinion because it would affect everybody. I can't say that I am thus far convinced. I would like, in theory, to like some of what, say, Marco Rubio and Mike Lee have been doing, but for every movement in my direction, it seems to take something away. A silly example, the mortgage interest tax deduction, which I, full disclosure, benefit from hugely, I'd like to see gone because it screws with the market. Now, unless I'm mistaken, they limit that. I don't think they zero it out completely. They also remove the local and state tax deduction, which corrupts the competition between the states as well. But then they add in all these child tax credits, and they're trying to engineer in other ways. If I had my way, they would just rip up the entire tax code and start again without any favors whatsoever. So there are good instincts there, but I can't say thus far I've been convinced, no.
Rip up the tax code. We're going to end on that note. Thanks everybody for joining us.